Hi, everybody. So glad to see so many familiar faces. Glad to see new names and faces. I'm going to jump right into this presentation, try to move fast to see if I can leave like maybe 5 minutes for some Q&A, maybe even 10. So here we go. So I like to ground my presentations in the concept of shared humanity, which is one part of provocation, one part a line of inquiry, and one part an aspiration. Because I think what we've done in the world is actually create space where we're not necessarily thinking about shared humanity. And that's historic, right? And so I want to give you a little bit of how I even got to this point of thinking about shared humanity, trauma and stress, and its relationship to work or the future of work and workplace environments. So I spent a lot of time in the intersections of public health, mental health, and art. And when I was 22, for context, I'm 35. When I was 22, I was introduced to this organizational cultural model called the sanctuary model, created by Philadelphia's own Dr. Sandra Bloom, who I'm fortunate enough has become a friend and a mentor to me. But I learned about her work, and it stunned me because I'd never heard anyone talk about systems through the lens of through the concept of humanity, right? That organizations are ideated, or systems even are ideated and powered by human beings, and therefore can be changed easier than we think by human beings, but not without diligence, effort, and concentrated intentionality. And so being trained in that model over the years got me to thinking about, what should this look like in places of policy and places of organizational culture that might not naturally center on someone's humanity. So places like social work, and I'm not saying these fields are perfect in terms of honoring shared humanity, but there's at least some frameworks in there to talk about those ideas. Social work, public health, even medical care. There's something there to kind of have that conversation. The moment you cross over to just like a bookstore, right? Or you cross over to, I'm trying to think of another rando job. Yeah, fast food, right? Like there's not necessarily inputs there to talk about or think about someone's humanity and their well-being. And so in the context of Philadelphia, where many of us are trying to figure out how do you help young people and even older folks make transitions in an economy that's shifting so rapidly, and naturally led me and a friend of mine who I think is on Luke Butler to start digging through a lot of literature reviews and research around what is the future of work? What does it look like? What do the trends say? And so Pew, some years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, did this really great work compiling a number of informational interviews with economists and behavioralists and organizational psychologists looking at the future of work, and a number of these futurists too. And this is a statement that they made that really blew my mind. It was kind of like the organizing principle of this whole document, right? That the future of work was going to focus on the idea of unique human skills and the need to nurture those skills to make a successful transition for systems. And so these skills are creativity. Excuse me, I'm getting alerts for payroll, which I already did. These skills are looking at creativity, collaboration, things like complex communication. So think about conflict management, conflict resolution, and this idea of the ability to thrive in diverse environments, right? A term that we might want to just call social intelligence in the 21st century, right? And so what was clear to me is that these were all, as the document pointed out, core human skills, which as a man of science led me to the next question, right? Because science is all about getting to the next question, not necessarily about finding the answer. And so the next question for me was like, wow, it's our skills and this place of our humanity that really is going to root us and ground us in a successful transition to these future economies. Well, then what the hell makes us human, right? Like that was my big question. And then it led me to my first thought, which was, oh my gosh, we've never had to answer this question from a space or concept of shared humanity. In fact, we've only answered this question mostly in negation, right? That some people are human because these other people are not human. And these people who are human therefore get rights that the non-humans do not get, right? And we've done that to a number of groups of people, Black people, Jewish people, Eastern Europeans. I mean, there's a number of folks, Latinx folks, right? We can get into other spaces of identity, LGBTQIA identity. I mean, there's just a number of places where we have denied personhood and humanity and the rights that come with personhood and humanity to a number of folks. And therefore, when we have to think about policy, when we have to think about economic policy, when we have to think about program design and policies within programs, this can get complicated because we're not always thinking about the well-being of humans. We're often thinking about the well-being of some humans and the posterity of some humans. And that's a big point of contention for me as both a thinker and budding researcher and a practitioner. So that led me to my next space, right? What is it about humans and human development and the environments that we're in? How do they react to one another? How do they collide with one another? And so I really got into this space around biopsychosocial development, right? That development happens in multiple dimensions at the same time, and that we have to be thoughtful about these dimensional places of our existence and influencers on our well-being, influences on how we develop skills. But then I also kept reading over the years and started to think about, but what about our emotions and meaning making and the fact that humans have a very complex emotional landscape, the fact that our emotions and the emotional parts of our brain are subsumed in the cognitive parts of our brain, that emotional reasoning and cognition actually share a lot of the same circuitry, right? We didn't know that 30, 40 years ago. We learned that within the last 20 years, and it's been revolutionary in the places that have, really metabolized that information, but in other spaces and places, they've not metabolized that information. A lot of places haven't even been exposed to those kinds of ideas, right? And so I offer just a resource to everybody. Harvard has a Center on the Developing Child that has a series of brilliant working papers that are accessible, beautifully written, and have a ton of information in them. Please check them out because they have a lot in here on the emotional circuitry of the brain and the body and its relationship to one another. It's pretty fascinating. So what I found through further literature digs over time was that the developmental scientists really started to think about the fact that there is a fourth dimension, partly because of the fact that we have a really complex emotional landscape. Humans can feel two different emotions at the same time. You can feel multiple emotions at the same time. You make meaning out of things in your life. You bring meaning with you into every experience that you are going to walk into. And you don't have a choice on whether or not you're going to make meaning. It's actually just a part of the human experience, right? So they added a fourth category to development, the spiritual. And so that's where we're at in the contemporary world of developmental science, that development for a human is in four dimensions that are co-occurring at the same time, right? They're all happening at the same time. You're biologically developing, psychologically developing, socially developing, and spiritually developing. Spiritual not being religious, but spiritual being about the space of meaning making, right? Having to make sense of things that are often larger than you, out of your control, things that you've inherited, larger narrative and messaging we get about groups of people, about ourselves, meaning that's reflected back to you about your space and worth in the world. There are all kinds of ways that we have to make meaning and are making meaning at any given moment. And what was fascinating to me about those skill sets that were listed in that first slide is that they actually have varying levels of correlation or varying levels of relationships to these dimensions, right? And that for me was pretty fascinating when starting to think about, well, what can disrupt development? What can disrupt what would be considered normative or traditional healthy development? One thing we know in the 21st century, chronic stress is a huge problem, huge problem. Wish I had time to go into it. This is a quick talk, but we know that stress is a killer. We know that stress in bursts of more than 20 to 25 minutes becomes poisonous to the whole body, the central nervous system, every major organ. Your stress mechanism or stress response system is connected to every major organ in your body, right? That's one of the reasons why physiologically being overstressed or chronically stressed is a huge medical issue or a huge biological issue. So couple of things in this area, right? The list here of some chronic stressors, not all chronic stressors, but this is a list of 5 that regardless of your income level are still really stressful, because you can be parenting alone and make a good amount of money, but your 2-year-old doesn't want your money. They actually want your time. And that's a very hard thing to negotiate when you are a single parent. Again, regardless of how much money you got, you might be able to afford a nanny or an au pair, but the kid wants you. And what's it like for you as that parent when the kid is healthily attaching and deeply bonding with the nanny or au pair, and you actually want your kid to be bonding and attaching to you in that same kind of way and with that same kind of depth? This is why it can be stressful. And one dimension of how parenting alone, even with a lot of money, can be really stressful. But again, all 5 of these areas, regardless of whether or not you have money, really stressful. Having very little access to funds, not having enough money, can make these things even more complicated, right? But it's important to highlight that chronic stress is different from trauma. Trauma, as the definition says here, involves a perceived or literal threat to your physical or emotional well-being, and is going to bring out intense feelings of helplessness, terror, or a lack of control. Now, 2 nuances here. We cannot tell other people what's traumatic in their lives. They are the ones who know their emotional experience in any given moment. They're the ones who are experts in their experience, and they're the ones that will be able to identify whether or not they're feeling those things, or even if they can't identify them directly, through storytelling, through narrative, through relationship and communication, trusted communication, they can begin to express to you and talk to you about their situations. And you can begin to hear like, oh, wow, that is actually an example of helplessness, the way you're describing that. Or wow, that is, yeah, you did not have control in that moment or in that situation, and that is powerlessness. So I hear you, yeah, okay. The other thing is, we can't tell someone in their perception what might threaten them physically or emotionally. We can learn from someone by being in relationship with them what might threaten them physically or emotionally, but we can't tell them that because it is about perception. And I begin to think heavily about the workplace in terms of microaggressions, in terms of the ways that people can be primed to think about their experiences from a meaning making and a historical standpoint. So for example, if we are running a business where we're working with former foster youth as an example, if we continually refer to them in the handbook and in all of our material and in public as former foster youth, what might that be doing for a person when it's bringing them back to places and spaces, potentially priming them to go back mentally to remembering spaces and places of their helplessness, their lack of control, or even some terror. And this is what I mean by like, are we setting people up for their best in terms of organizational culture when we are not considering how people's traumas or experiences of powerlessness, helplessness, a lack of control could be being primed or referred or being pointed at, even in ways that we don't mean to cause harm, right? It's something for us to have to consider in the 21st century. And so here in Philadelphia in particular, I think this is what we're dealing with overwhelmingly, particularly right now. You add in COVID-19, you add in this new era of civil rights movement that we're all experiencing. A lot of people are living at the intersection of traumas and chronic stressors. And here's the tricky part, right? Not all chronic stressors or stressors are inherently traumatic, but all trauma is inherently stressful. And so what we're dealing with is exponential toxicity. That's what I like to call it. It's an overactivation of the body's stress response system and all the other fallout that comes psychologically, socially, in the space of meaning making, biologically. When we think about development in those 4 dimensions, there are a lot of outcomes that come at all 4 of those dimensions when people are left to have to live in exponentially toxic environments. And we have to consider the fact that in the 21st century, the workplace and the workplace environment has become a place of both traumatic experiences and chronic stressors for many, many people. Now, this is all to me really fascinating because at the end of the day, what we want from people is to, again, crossing over into the 21st century workplace, we're trying to build all these skill sets that are resilient in the face of automation and that are uniquely human and that need human relationships to really develop, because you actually develop complex and abstract communication skills in communication with other human beings and refining them. You develop conflict management and conflict resolution skills by being actually in conflict and in relationship with other people and studying these things and working them out. You develop them by actually having the space to make mistakes with other humans and not having one or two mistakes end up as a zero-sum game. So I was trying to figure out, well, what else do we need to understand in these spaces? And so some further literature review work had me run across some articles of other literature reviews that I found fascinating. So the list on the left comes from a group of organizational psychologists that looked at the successful, in quotes, successful leadership domains and character traits of CEOs and entrepreneurs. And that's a list they came up with from series of interviews and a number of other survey tools. The list on the right here comes from the work of Martin Seligman and a number of positive psychologists looking at, and really quickly, positive psychology not being positive thinking, but the inverse of psychology. Psychology as a field is traditionally pathological. It means it's always looking at what's wrong with a person. It's deficit-based. Positive psychology takes an asset-based approach. Well, what goes right with a person when things go wrong in their life? How do human beings thrive and flourish? How do they do their best? How do they achieve and optimally thrive and exist in a place of well-being and fulfillment and meaning, right? So this list on the right actually is a list of about 50 years worth of research that looked at what are the character virtues and skill sets that buffer psychopathology or the deterioration of one's mental health. What are the character virtues and skill sets that will buffer the deterioration of one's mental health? Now, what's fascinating about these two lists, right, because they're two different siloed areas of study and research, they are synonyms, really, like point for point. What's also fascinating is these are very hard to measure. They're very hard, and again, they're character virtues or character traits and their skill sets, right, or domains of skill sets. And we have to pull those apart because those are two different things, right? Courage is not a skill set in this context on the right, it's a character virtue. And you can grow aspects of a character virtue for sure, but it's not a skill set that you're growing, like interpersonal skills, which is really about a lot of communication, how to work in a team, how to show up and do teamwork, right? Not just how do we communicate, but how does our workflow, complement each other, etc. Those are skill sets that you can actually literally measure, watch over time, and grow. Courage is a little trickier, right? But we know it's necessary. We know that people need developmental courage to actually maneuver through, again, these economic changes. And when I kept parsing through this literature review again, I was like, wow, and some of these character virtues are almost like prerequisites for being able to, for example, thrive in diverse environments. You got to want to be in a diverse environment to even be able to figure out what it's like to thrive there. So I kind of took the reverse approach for a second and said, all right, if development's in 4 parts or 4 dimensions, you need all these dimensions really attuned to your health, and all of these dimensions matter. You don't get to just pick which ones are going to impact your skill development, which ones are going to impact your well-being, what's going to impact your health, your personal psychology will impact your biology. The thing that I had to really think about was is it better for us to focus on individuals, or as humans, is it better for us to think about the environment? Are we actually designing the environments to contain inputs at all 4 of these levels for our well-being? Are we designing environments to have inputs at all 4 of those levels that will help us develop these complex skills and character virtues? And how are we doing that in a way that honors the nuances of identity, racial identity, gender identity, class-based identity, the one that we don't always like to talk about? It's easy to talk about race and gender. It's real hard for us to talk about class. So, and not that it's super easy to talk about race and gender, I just want to be clear on that. But I have found that we're willing to talk about race in ways that we're not willing to talk about class and capitalism. So I'm going to be really clear about what I mean there. So, a thought here about workplace culture and how we can begin to assess for these ideas around empathy in the 21st century. Because the hard part is when we're trying to build skill sets, if people aren't in these human skill sets and these human virtues, if people aren't in trusting, loving environments, it's kind of going to be a wrap. Like you're not going to teach, or people are not going to learn or pick up the things that we're intending. They're going to pick up and learn and attune to, well, what will keep me safe in this moment. So I want to suggest to you that empathy as a construct might work better if it's a little selfish first. So rather than trying to identify with me as a Black person, this is in the context of a non-Black person. If a non-Black person really wants to understand my struggle, my experience as a Black cis man, that might be really difficult, right? You can't actually, as another parallel, right? I've never had cancer. I can't actually know what it's like to have cancer unless I actually have cancer. Because to assume that I can is actually minimizing the experience of the person that has cancer. It diminishes their narrative. It can also just start to shut people up, because now you're talking for them and on their behalf as if you understand what's actually transpiring, and what they might be trying to do is just establish themselves and be affirmed in their experience. And we're just smushing, or I'm just smushing all over that. So what's it like to actually be a little bit selfish first, and instead of trying to use a social factor or an experiential factor or an identity-based factor to build empathy for another person or with another person, what if I selfishly looked at the emotional experiences instead of the social or identity factors, right? What if I look at, hey, have I actually felt powerless in a given context? Have I ever felt like I lacked control? Have I ever been disoriented or confused, minimized? Have I ever felt like anytime I try a thing, I'm going to fail at it and I just am hopeless about it? Have I ever felt embarrassment or shame? If I can locate one of them, and these are not the only experiences and they're negative, but I wanted to pick some visceral things for a moment, because dehumanization tends to have a lot of these kinds of feelings. And that's what we're trying to work through, right? Given my examples about microaggressions in the workplace, et cetera. If I can locate these experiences on the inside of me and remember what they felt like, and remember the displeasure, remember the ostracization, remember that I felt not so good and actually was not primed to do my best or do well, I can now use that as a starting place to go, I might not understand the social or identity-based factors or the experiential factors around this other person's experience, but what I do know is that if it might be making them feel disoriented or confused or powerless, I do know what that feels like. And I don't want them to feel like that. Or I don't want them to have to navigate the next 6 hours at work like that. And I recognize that because I don't know the social factors, it's even possible, or the identity-based factors, it's even possible that what I remember feeling is magnified 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 times in that person's experience, and could be worse than I could even put my mind around. So now this gives me a space to go, empathically, how can I show up as a better ally, a better listener? How can I show up as a comrade, a co-conspirator when needed to be, right? So instead of being in a place where I start to say things that minimize or diminish someone's narrative and disaffirms or unaffirms their experience, now I can actually listen better, or at least be motivated to listen better, motivated to ask questions around care, and motivated to figure out and ask questions like, how can I show up on your behalf? Because what I'm hearing in your stories, it might sound like that's powerlessness, and I hate that you feel that way. How can I show up on your behalf? How can I collaborate with you? Whatever the case is, it's a different way to think about empathy than trying to understand, again, in my case, what it's like to be Black and you're not Black. All that being said, for me, when I think about all these things summarized, here's where we land up, right? Or end up. I'll just let you look at this really quickly. But the future of work, automation, the gig economy, there's something called the silver tsunami. A lot of people are retiring without trained folks to take over their work. There's an increasing need for soft skills and behavioral skills. And we're dealing with a number of things that are just a reality of chronic stress, trauma, racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, wealth disparities, climate disasters. It's just the reality of the world, right? And this is how I see it showing up in market demand, or how it was showing up in market demand, particularly in my world where people are asking me for things. And I just kept going like, I don't know. There's gotta be a different way to look at this, right? It can't be that all we need to do is focus on opportunity youth and the world will change. So this is how I actually began to rethink this in the context of everything you've heard me talk about, right? That at the end of the day, work is a place where we practice and learn human skills. Employers need to learn and practice these things as much as the employees and those who are trying to introduce into the workforce. That we are going to have to define, design, and iterate what inclusivity, belongingness, equity, and justice actually looks like on a systems level, to then begin to think about what should policy, both formal and informal policy, the formal policy being culture, things that aren't necessarily legislated, but we do in our behavior and we practice. What does that need to look like? And everybody is a learner, point blank. Everyone, from the CEO, the board chair, down to entry level, whatever program we're in, we are all learning, because we have not had an actualized and operationalized definition on shared humanity that we've all metabolized, that we've all taken in, and then used to craft healthier workspaces and places. So with that said, it's 12:27, I'm done. I wish I had time to share with you some of the, there's a lot of research literature around the impact of stress in disrupting skill recall, that's skills you already know, in disrupting skill development. And there's a fascinating group of researchers that have looked at how does someone's space of personal identity, when it's reconnected back to moments of powerlessness, right? When it's primed in an environment for them to think about their identity, connected to experiences of powerlessness, impacts executive function, impacts a whole bunch of stuff. So in terms of skill recall and usage in a workplace or in a cognitive task like solving math problems, etc. Really fascinating stuff. Thank you all so much for coming. There's probably room for like a question or two. I'm gonna turn it back over to Jake.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, Michael. It was illuminating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, we do have a couple minutes here. If people want to ask questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can just throw them into the chat as well. And Michael, if you did want to share anything else with people, I'm happy to share those resources out after this.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely, you'll get some nice articles in a bundle, friends.
Excellent. Cool, cool.
Want to jump in with a question?
Hi, Karen.
Hey, Michael, how you doing? So I'm, I'd love, obviously, the framework. There's a lot to dig in such a short piece, but I'm really curious, maybe from your own work, how you sort of dealt with some of the cultural practices of emotional suppression that is particularly in the masculine space. Sort of how, like, that's a lot to ask, from an overall workplace perspective. How have you sort of been approaching dealing with those kind of cultural practices, the things we don't talk about from that lens?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, right? Like the premise I start with goes back to the comment I made around the emotional circuitry in the brain being subsumed in the cognitive circuitry, right? So if we repress our emotions, we are actually stunting cognition. We're stunting the ability to problem solve. We are stunting the ability to actually receive stimuli in that can give us a lot more information than we're used to taking in. So the first premise for me is always around, like, this is about helping you achieve optimal performance. This is in a workplace context when people are like, we don't have time to do emotions. That's not what we're here for. We're here to make a profit. It's like, cool. Well, I can show you and map to you through valuation and map to you through like human reasoning of how the body works, that if you actually don't create some inputs for emotional processing and reasoning and the space for people to bring that, the fullness of their humanity to work, you're actually stunting your own profit margins. Now, that's one space, right? And there, again, the research around chronic stress and skill recall, et cetera, I use all of that. Now, the space around masculinity is a bit of a different dig. I often go, we make fun of women or people who can be connected to their emotions as being weak, or like it's feminine, as if that's a negative term. But it is really a strength and a powerful space to be able to honor the emotional landscape as it currently exists for you. That is, so it's about really recognizing, to me, and speaking to other boys about this or men about this. It's like, what have we actually given up in our humanity and in our experiences and in our potential by just completely digging into this idea that emotions are not masculine? What have we lost? That always starts an interesting series of conversations. Like, people are like, I didn't lose anything. And then other people in the room are like, actually, I know exactly what I lost, right? And then people are like, whoa, 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 whoa. And I learned that from other people. That's not a Michael Bryan, like I made that up. I learned that from other facilitators and some elders that I sat around with and was like, wow, that is a powerful question.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, and we had another question come in through the chat, Michael. Are you writing a short book? Someone asked.
Who asked that?
Let me see. Elise or Alice, sorry.
Alice. I need to probably write a short book. I'm probably behind at this point, if I'm honest with myself. I saw a thumbs up. I appreciate that. Yes, I will be working on a short book. I am working on an essay that'll be out at the end of the month. So yeah, I've been fortunate to write in some of the local periodicals, but I should do some more writing.
Awesome. Well, we're just about out of time here. So I just want to say thank you again, Michael. This was great. A lot of thanks coming in through the chat. So I know everyone really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you, everyone. I'm looking now. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you all coming. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Absolutely. Everyone take care, and we'll see you at the next session.
All righty. Take care.